Hello everyone and welcome to this morning's NCVO webinar that we're pleased to be hosting in partnership with our trusted supplier Zurich Insurance. I'm Nick, the Networks and Engagement Manager here at NCVO, and it's great to be joining so many of you online today. Please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't done so already. Now, charities can play a hugely important role in safeguarding within communities, and good safeguarding practice should be embedded into our day-to-day activities. So to help us explore this, in just a moment, I'll be handing over to Alex Cunningham, a safeguarding risk consultant from Zurich Insurance, who'll be leading today's webinar, sharing an essential introduction and refresher to safeguarding children and adults. Alex will lead us through content for 30 to 40 minutes, which she's developed having taken into account the common safeguarding questions that you put forward as part of the registration process for today's webinar. After the presentation, we're hoping to have a good 15 minutes or so for a Q&A, which will be facilitated by Alex's colleague, Matt Hardwick, a senior risk consultant at Zurich. A slight caveat ahead of the Q&A, because we have so many people joining us online and the number of questions we'll be able to get through will be limited. So if you want to ask a question, please keep them as general as possible so that others can take away learning from the responses that are given, avoiding things that are very specific to your own organisation. However, during the webinar, we will signpost you to further support and safeguarding resources, which I'm sure can help answer some of the questions that we won't have time for. But before we get started, let's briefly run through the housekeeping slide. So closed captions have been enabled and they'll be appearing on screen. To turn these on or off, please click on the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. To help with accessibility, the slides for today's event will be shared in the chat in just a moment as a PDF. So if it would help, you can download these to your computers to zoom in and out the slides as we go along. Today's webinar is being recorded, but everyone has joined in view only mode, so your cameras and your microphones are both automatically turned off. The only people that you can see on today's webinar will be those who are presenting, and the recording will be uploaded to the NCVO YouTube channel later on this week. As I've mentioned, we will have a Q&A partway through today's webinar. So if you've got a question that you'd like to ask Alex, please add this via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You'll be able to see all the questions that other people are posting. So if you wanted to ask a similar question to one that's already been posted, instead of typing your own version of that question, you can like that specific question that others have already asked, and that will help us kind of go to the questions that most people have in the room. We're not planning a break for today, but if you need to step away from your computer for any reason, please feel free to do so. And finally, we're going to send a follow-up email shortly after the webinar with the whole slide deck and a link to all the things that we mentioned. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and to get us started and deep dive into the content around kind of safeguarding essentials for charities, I'm pleased to now hand over to Alex Cunningham from Zurich. So Alex, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Nick. Great. I'm really excited today to be talking to you all about this really important topic, safeguarding essentials for charities. I work with Zurich Resilience Solutions, which is part of Zurich, and my background is as a social worker and working in various charities in different roles overseas and in the UK. It's a topic that's obviously incredibly important. NCVO do a lot of work on it and have excellent resources, which I'll kind of point you to at various points throughout the presentation and at the end, and Nick will refer to as well. The presentation today the webinar today is really going to be, as it's titled, an essential. So it is a huge topic, safeguarding, and you all come from a variety of different charities who do different important work in your communities. So we'll have different risks and different challenges around safeguarding. This will be an overview that kind of covers the main areas, but I would kind of encourage you kind of following the session to look further kind of from the various resources that I pass on and share, and to think about your own organisation in a kind of more bespoke, specific way for yourself. But hopefully this is a really good pointer to get you started and encourage more discussions and thoughts and kind of planning around what you might need. So what we will cover today, we'll do a bit of the basics, so look at kind of definitions of what safeguarding means, We'll look at very important expectations from the Charity Commission. We'll also look at some statutory guidance around children and adults at risk that is applicable to England, and kind of what you need to consider and pointing you in the right direction of what to look at there. And then we'll kind of look at kind of 5-step kind of process of a safeguarding cycle. So helping you to think about the different steps that you might need to take and breaking those down, because I know that it can feel like a big, quite scary kind of topic, and there's a lot, there is complexity to it. However, as I kind of said, there's a lot of resources available, and breaking it down step by step, I think can really help you with kind of managing the risks that might be around for you with regards to safeguarding. And then there's further resources available as well. So fundamentally, safeguarding is about making sure that the ability of every adult and child lives safely, free from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. It's about making sure that all children are protected from these harms. And for adults, as a charity, there's a duty of care to make sure that your staff and volunteers are safe. But there's also kind of other additional kind of responsibilities around adults that may not be able to, that are at greater risk and or less able to protect themselves from harm because of their circumstances and or needs for care and support. And we'll talk through that in a second, kind of what that means from a legal definition. But as I said, anybody can be at risk of abuse. So what you really need to be thinking about is safeguarding in a holistic way. So there can be narrow definitions that look at kind of legal definitions of child protection or adults at risk that are important to think about. But actually, for what the Charity Commission and kind of best practice is really to take a holistic, wide-ranging perspective on this, thinking about all the different kinds of people that come into contact with your charity, how they come into contact with them, and what risks might apply to them and their specific circumstances and different groups of individuals. Today we're looking at safeguarding from an organisational perspective. So we won't be kind of going into lots of detail around kind of what kind of child protection specifically looks like, or what kind of adult at risk kind of work specifically looks at like, or adult protection work. That's kind of, there's other resources that you can follow on for that. So this is really about thinking about kind of organizational perspective, the systems, the processes, the structures, and very importantly, the culture as well within your organization that supports to make sure that these that children and adults, everybody who comes into contact with your organisation is safe. And there are laws, guidance and regulation to support the process. Also, I guess, it's really important, I think, to kind of draw on the fact that a lot of the kind of laws, guidance, regulation that exists in the UK has come out of the incredible campaigning that charities, the important role that charities have played in advocating for vulnerable people. Actually, it's, charities play such an important role in delivering the key services that you do in your communities, but also that campaigning work and that social justice work has often come out of charities in order to strengthen this area of work. And everybody in an organisation has a role to play in safeguarding. It should become a part of day-to-day activities and the day-to-day culture. So in terms of just some definitions, definition of a child in England is anyone under the age of 18, and safeguarding children duties apply to any charity working with or coming into contact anyone under the age of 18. So it's a consideration you need to think about. And there's a specific definition which I've included here that kind of hones in a little bit around that. But as I say, it is also about thinking about it holistically and what's kind of how you keep children, young people safe. In terms of kind of safeguarding adults at risk, in England, the definition of adult is anyone aged 18 or over, and it's about again, making sure that adults at risk are protected and have the right to live in safety and free from abuse and neglect. Importantly, a consideration in some of the questions that you put forward, the areas you'd like to see covered today, very accurately, is about that your charity might have trustees, staff, volunteers, beneficiaries, and other connections who are classed as adults at risk. So you need to take that into consideration and think about that within your specific organisation. And I've included a definition of the kind of statutory definition of what an adult at risk in England, what that kind of threshold looks like. But again, I would encourage you to think broadly around what that could be. So thinking about the Charity Commission expectations, I've included some specific quotes from legislation, which we'll move on to in a minute, and the Charity Commission here, just to direct you to the parts that are, I think, particularly relevant. There are some good resources available from the Charity Commission that are easy to read, accessible. I've included links to those, and the key one is this one that I've quoted from. But the Charity Commission are clear that they want charities to look at safeguarding in a holistic way, and that it is an essential responsibility and priority. Responsibilities do lie with trustees, but as we know, those can be delegated on a daily basis to staff members, to kind of manage those processes, but fundamentally the responsibilities do lie with trustees. We'll get onto that a little bit later around some recommendations around trustees' involvement with some of these processes. And again, just to kind of reiterate about the responsibilities, it's everybody who comes into contact with the organisation. So staff, volunteers, people who benefit from the charity's work, and anybody else who comes into contact. The Charity Commission have produced a very helpful kind of overview of some of the 10 kind of top actions that trustees should be considering. It's really helpful. I won't go into each of them at this point because we'll be covering them off as I go through the rest of the webinar, but you can see kind of keywords from that, and key areas are kind of policies, risk assessments, culture, which I think I'll keep coming back to, that word will keep popping up, and the supporting everybody within the organisation to be able to recognise, respond, report and record any safeguarding allegations or concerns. Evaluation of safeguarding training, important, so not only having safeguarding training, but the evaluation of it and the feeding back through the process of how effective that training is. A couple of points around DBS checks, which again we'll also look at, and then also specific mention around working overseas, to making sure that any kind of work there is done kind of within appropriate guidelines. And kind of following on from that, there is some very helpful advice and guidance from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. They are also clear in their expectations about the partners they work with, and more broadly for any charities that have links overseas or work overseas, that there is robust steps in place to be able to manage safeguarding allegations, concerns and incidents. And they do have their own reporting mechanism for reporting of concerns to them, specifically kind of for that sector. You also, some of you might be aware of the misconduct disclosure scheme, which also assists with this. So that's for humanitarian development and other civil society organisations to support the recording. So when an organisation needs to report a staff member that's worked internationally, they can do so in order to kind of close the gap of potentially people who might move from organisation to organisation with misconduct concerns about them that haven't been passed on. So that's a helpful kind of scheme that's also available. Again, that there's a link at the end of the presentation for that. And just kind of moving on to the kind of statutory guidance, and I won't linger too long on this, because I really just wanted to kind of point you to the kind of most applicable parts of the legislation and the guidance for you to be able to have a look at. But again, it's just to reiterate that within the kind of statutory guidance for children and adults at risk, there is specific mention for voluntary organisations and charities to play a part in this. So, and again, very similar messaging to the Charity Commission and any other kind of resource you look at around safeguarding, to make sure that policies and systems are in place, and that all practitioners, paid or volunteer, need to be understanding of their responsibilities. And again, there's a definition around kind of what an allegation, kind of might look like there. And for kind of adults at risk, we have the Care Act statutory guidance as well, which I've linked to, and I've directed you to certain aspects, certain sections of that guidance to be able to assist you with that. I've included links for both the NSPCC and the Ancraft Trust at the end. They both have excellent resources, as do NCVO, where they both separately work with give specific guidance around NSPCC, focus on children and young people, and Craft Trust look at adults, and their guidance is excellent to be able to help you unpick this a little bit more. So thinking about the kind of safeguarding cycle, there are a number of different steps that we can take to kind of break safeguarding down into different areas. This is hopefully a bit of a helpful kind of starting point for you to start to think about how you would break down the steps that you need to take for your organisation to start looking at this, continually improve how you're looking at it. And we start with identifying the risk. That's the first step. You need to understand what risks exist in your specific organisation. I could kind of show you a safeguarding policy from another charity that would be completely unapplicable to yours, because the work you do is different, the context is different, the people you work with is different, and actually it doesn't work for your organisation for a variety of different reasons. So you'll see that it's quite common. You can find kind of templates of safeguarding policies, for example, out there, but it's not common for those to be kind of, I wouldn't kind of share those in this setting, because it's really important for you to work out what's appropriate for your organisation, and you do that process kind of from the inside, because you have the best understanding of what you do, and generic policies don't really support. So with this first step, you're looking at risk assessments, risk management frameworks, and kind of thinking about that within your wider kind of risk management approach. In each of these points, I'll go through in more detail in a minute. The second step is prevention, so stopping abuse from happening in the first place, having a culture within an organisation where there's robustness in policies, procedures, there's an understanding of the challenges that come for people to report incidents or abuse, and the complexities of managing that. Thinking about trauma-informed approaches to understand the barriers for people, either victim survivors or people who have concerns about others in the organisation, that there's barriers to people reporting. So thinking about it at that point, kind of prior to the formal steps kicking in, kind of in the next steps here. And within that, we also need to think about training and safer recruitment, so those kind of prevention steps. The next aspect would be reporting, so making sure that your reporting procedures are robust, and again, kind of culture of the organisation, how those are managed. Fourth step is about responding, so the organisational response and the practical steps that you might take or you might need to consider. And then the last part, incredibly important, and kind of reiterated through a lot of the guidance that's available through Charity Commission and other important sources, is about learning and making sure that there's a kind of learning and feedback loop in place, so that all of those first steps, learning comes from that, and the system, you support your system to be able to be more robust as you learn through different incidents that you might experience. In terms of that first step, the identifying, so I've kind of split it down into a couple of different areas here. You really need to take the time as an organisation to do an initial risk assessment and think about that within your kind of wider risk management approach. It's really good practice to get staff and volunteers to feed into this process, because they'll be the experts on where some of the day-to-day challenges are, and where the kind of potential gaps or kind of potential safeguarding risks might sit day to day. So getting a wide variety of kind of input into that is really helpful. There should be a designated safeguarding lead for your charity. That's very important in terms of best practice, and also a trustee with the responsibility for safeguarding as well. It also is, best practice to have a senior manager be the point of contact to manage allegations that come through, but that could also be the same person as the designated safeguarding lead. And in terms of that relationship between the kind of trustee and the designated safeguarding lead, that's an important relationship that those people need to work together. As we've kind of talked about already, the trustees have ultimate responsibility for this area of work, and if kind of incidents happen, they need to have an overview of that and understand that. They also, being a critical friend is a really important role that trustees can play, as can the designated safeguarding lead and vice versa, to be able to think about how individual incidents are managed, but the whole kind of framework. And I think it's really about coming from, having that culture of thinking about, there could be an incident here rather than it won't happen here. Having that openness of saying, well, any organization has risks around safeguarding, and you need to kind of the culture that really supports reporting and positive action is thinking it could happen. So how do we manage this as to the best possible way, and how do we limit the possibility of something happening? There is specific guidance as well around operating online, and that's really important that you consider that right from the get-go. At the identification stage, Charity Commission are clear that it's not just face-to-face work, it's online work. As we move into, as we're often in the digital world now, that needs to be kind of considered, and the Charity Commission has some good resources to help you think about that and pose some helpful questions. And I think really, the fundamental part of this is that it needs to be much more than a tick box exercise. It's about, but it's also about thinking about what's proportional to the level of risk that your charity has. So thinking about it very specifically. The kind of second aspect is around prevention. So this is where kind of policies and procedures start to kind of play a role after you've done that risk assessment work. They need to be clear and direct everybody in the organisation to the right people, i.e. the designated safeguarding lead, and also potentially trustee as well. You have to make sure that all staff and volunteers read these policies. It's fundamental step so that they've read them and they understand them. You need to think about the kind of range of different policies and procedures that you might need, again, that's applicable for your organisation, and proportionate to your organisation and what you do. So you need to think about policies, at least one safeguarding policy, associated procedures, and a code of conduct would be really encouraged, and that is identified by the Charity Commission within their kind of expectations. And then also other associated policies that kind of go alongside the safeguarding that we're talking about: health and safety, digital safety, bullying, harassment, and very importantly, whistleblowing policies and procedures as well. And in terms of kind of reviewing these policies, there's an expectation that these are reviewed regularly. What regularly means is not necessarily kind of clearly defined, but best practice would be at least once a year. And certainly kind of following a serious incident as well. But yeah, even if there's not necessarily been a significant incident that year, looking at it and checking that it's still fit for purpose for your charity, and nothing has changed in that year is good to do. And it's also really important to kind of consider the range of activities that your charity operates, including ad hoc events, which might require more complex kind of risk assessments and policies associated. What some of the key kind of wording, and there is some helpful advice around kind of what safeguarding policies can look like. You know, it's really important that those policies set out how clearly your commitment is to protecting children, young people, and adults. That kind of cultural kind of commitment needs to be really clear within your kind of written documentation. And then kind of along with that, the kind of more day-to-day, how that's managed and the procedures around it. Please think as well about kind of relevant legislation, and hopefully this webinar is helpful to point you in the right direction of some of that key legislation that you need to think about in the Charity Commission kind of guidelines. And you need to think about who you work with, if that's adults at risk, if it's a general adult population, or children and young people, and go to that key guidance that I've pointed you to, and make sure that that's kind of up to date. Your policies and procedures, policy at least should be publicly available, and you may have internal documentation for other policies or some of the more procedural elements, but best practice to have your safeguarding policy publicly available. And you should also think about low-level concerns. So what I mean by that is kind of when there's been an allegation or a gut feeling or a concern raised by somebody, potentially including a staff member about a colleague, you need to think about how you're going to manage those concerns. And you know, robust organisations that have strong work in this area, they tend to take a really holistic approach. So it's not a high level kind of threshold in order to report something, but then the reporting and the management of that is considered kind of in advance, so that there is kind of fairness for the staff member, or fairness for the person who there's been an allegation about, but also that concern is kind of is kind of responded to and dealt with. We know that often people will delay reporting because they feel they haven't got enough kind of evidence, or they haven't kind of seen enough, or it isn't kind of confirmed. But we also know that actually things can happen in organisations that when subsequent investigations happen, things were known in the organisation, there was concerns, but those things weren't kind of flagged at an earlier point. So it is important to take a more holistic approach and think about how you're going to deal with staff members coming to you with smaller concerns and kind of manage those. And there are some good resources out there again to support in managing that, and kind of how to write a policy around that. Thinking around kind of the culture of the organisation, this is incredibly important, and I think I've mentioned that word a lot because it's fundamental. The kind of it's top down really, so kind of setting the right tone for staff and volunteers and beneficiaries, to be able to speak up, encouraging speaking up at all possible opportunities, removing barriers for people to report, so removing barriers that make it complex or challenging, making sure you have the right people in place to be able to respond to those concerns when they come up. And then obviously as well, thinking about supporting survivors when they do, when somebody does report something, how is that dealt with? What does that feel like for that person? How has that process worked? And have they felt heard and listened to? And that's a really important aspect of the response, alongside some of the more technical policies and procedural elements that I would encourage you to think about. Training is incredibly important, and has got a key role in supporting and encouraging that positive culture. If you have training that is kind of encouraged in the organisation, it's established as something that everybody does, and there's a positive feelings towards that training. It's supported by managers. It's not seen as a tick box exercise just to get your safeguarding training done so you can go and do this other thing, but actually it's seen as kind of inherent. And within that training, it's well delivered and reflective of the organisation that you're in, and the risks that you guys face individually. Then the better that training is. Training does need to be provided to all staff and volunteers, irrespective of role. So we'll be encouraging, finance staff, IT staff as well to complete that. It's not just people who work directly with beneficiaries or service users, or it's actually because it's about a holistic approach in the organisation, and it really should think about kind of lessons learned from your own organisation, as well as kind of across the sector and what we know about challenges that other charities have had, or kind of other organisations, learnings from social work, etc. And a lot of that information is publicly available and accessible to translate into your training. The other aspect of kind of prevention is around about safer recruitment, key area. And again, there's some really good guidance available, which I've linked to, and I could talk about this for a very long time and into a lot of detail. So really just a bit of a summary here, but you need to make sure that volunteers and staff are suitable to work with children and adults at risk. It needs to be a continuous process rather than a one-off event, and those initial checks when somebody is hired or starts in a role, incredibly important. And I've got a list here of some of the key aspects that need to be considered, but also that kind of on an ongoing basis, you need to consider how often DBS checks might be redone, for example, or rechecked. And you need to kind of have, this needs to be linked in with your HR policies and any discipline policies as well, or volunteer code of conduct or volunteer policies that you have in place. It is important as well that overseas checks are made if somebody has lived overseas for a period of time or worked overseas. And again, there's guidance available on kind of how to do that and how to approach that. So in terms of the kind of the third aspect of reporting, your organisation, we've talked a lot around this, around kind of culture, but it's important that the mechanisms are in place, plus also the culture is in place to be able to support somebody to report. Another kind of really good aspect is around kind of good supervision and space to reflect for staff and volunteers. Robust charities that do this work really well take that into account early on. So providing those spaces within supervision and kind of line management, day-to-day line management of volunteers or staff, to be able to allow them to share anything that might be worrying them, or checking out how something is meant to be done, for example, and having that kind of open culture is really helpful. And obviously, making sure that the policies and procedures you have in place are actually followed in reality, and that's kind of what's been agreed by the organisation is what happens in practice. You also need to consider about potentially reporting a serious incident to the Charity Commission, depending on the level of incident. And again, there's very helpful guidance provided by the Charity Commission, which actually goes through different scenarios and different kind of examples of what would be a reportable incident and what isn't. Again, kind of responsibility lies with the charity trustees to do that, but it can be delegated. But there is a good clear guidance from the Charity Commission around what you should be reporting and what you wouldn't. Response kind of from the charity, it's important to kind of flag that, if you did think, somebody was in immediate danger, a child or an adult at risk, and they needed immediate help, you should report immediately to the police. There might be lots of different responses to an allegation or an incident. The police may need to be involved. You may need to report to the police, investigating a possible criminal offence. If there's any concerns around the possibility of a criminal offence, it needs to be reported to the police, and the police will make their decision and work with you and liaise around that. The local authority child protection services might make inquiries or assess a child's needs if that's applicable. Those reports would go through a LADO, which you might have worked with already, local authority designated officer, who would manage that process, liaise with the police, liaise with yourselves as charities, and also kind of and manage some of those processes and guide around what might need to happen with that individual that there might be an allegation around. And also obviously you need to think as well about disciplinary procedures and kind of HR processes. If you provide regulated activities or work with children, you have a legal duty to refer anyone who has left your organisation or moved on to a role which does not include regulated activity because they've harmed or they might have been at risk of harming a child. Just kind of read that out because it's very important. So you need to report that to relevant disclosure and barring agency, and failure to do that is a criminal offence. In terms of kind of the response as well, it's really important good record keeping, so that all records of conversations, discussions, actions taken, who's been present in those conversations is kind of all recorded. And lastly, is that last really important step of kind of feeding back, so that the kind of learning that you have from your experiences of managing investigations, managing allegations, as well as learning that exists, you know, in the wider sector. There's a lot of great resources that you can sign up to from the NSPCC and Craft Trust that provide you with kind of regular updates on significant kind of policy area changes. NCVO has fantastic resources as well that are kept up to date. So, you know, checking those out, keeping kind of aware of what's going on within this kind of sector and other learnings from other charities is really helpful as well. And some specific advice, for example, the Charity Commission advises that should be a standing item on trustee meetings around safeguarding and protecting people from harm. And, you know, again, the cultural aspect comes into play with this as well, as it does in every area, making sure that any learnings are shared throughout the organisation to promote a transparent approach, and kind of an approach of continuous learning within the organisation, and giving feedback and getting feedback from staff and volunteers. So that really kind of closes the kind of loop off. There's a lot more that I could go into around kind of each of these aspects, and kind of talk in detail around the potential kind of actions you could take, or policies and procedures that could be put into place. But I think, you know, hopefully that's been helpful for you to be able to have a bit of an overview, that then you can apply to your own charities, contexts and settings. And there's further support. I believe you have copies of these slides. So there's further support available. A couple of really great resources from NCVO, the Small Charity Help Desk, and NSPCC whistleblowing advice lines, excellent as well, and various other kind of resources I can point you to. So yeah, I'll pass over to my colleague Matt now for any questions you might have.
Thank you, Alex. Have a breather. That was, I think, as you sort of said at the start, it's difficult to get into all the detail in such a topic of this nature, and I think you've done a really good job at highlighting some of those key points. There have been a number of questions, so clearly what you've been saying has ignited some conversation amongst those on the screen. I'm going to endeavour to try and group these as best I can. We've had some around the policy, safeguarding policy that charities might have. As a starting point, now you use the term adults at risk. There's been a question around whether the term should be adults at risk, whether it's vulnerable adults. Is there a right or a wrong, or what is the correct way to refer to those individuals within a safeguarding policy?
So we would be using the phrase adults at risk within England. But you know, there is also kind of further. I guess the kind of language you choose from your organisation is what feels right for you. But in terms of kind of the statutory kind of language, it's adults at risk. I guess though, just to kind of widen that out a little bit, and the Craft Trust has very good resources I would really encourage you to have a look at. The kind of question around working with adults in general, because there's responsibilities to keep everybody safe, and an adult may be at risk at a particular point in time, and not at another point in time because of their varying needs that they have. And you need to think about your general population of adults. So in terms of kind of decision making around what that policy might look like, that would be kind of up to you as an organisation. But I would really encourage you to go and have a look at those further resources and think about what's most applicable for you.
Thank you, Alex. Following on the theme the safeguarding policy that an organisation would have. So there's been a question around an organisation that has a safeguarding policy in place for the direct care and provision that it provides in terms of the support, etc., and that safeguarding policy covers that. They've been perhaps indicated that actually their safeguarding policy should be broader than that and potentially include anybody that they may come into contact, whether that's through fundraising events or visitors on site, contractors, fundamentally anybody. Is that the case, or is the policy that they have around the provision of the service sufficient, or does it need to be broader to cover all of those individuals that may come into contact as part of the day-to-day working of the organisation?
I mean, yeah, I mean, best practice would be for it to cover everybody that comes into contact. That's what the Charity Commission, is expecting. Obviously, that could potentially be quite an unwielding kind of policy. So I think it's really about going back to that first step that I talked about around identifying where the key risks are and the level of risk that applies, and being proportionate in response to that. So if you're a charity who day to day doesn't work with children, for example, but does ad hoc events, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, that has children present, that does need to be included, because it is a part of your work, and given the risks and the kind of statutory kind of expectations around that it needs to be covered within your policies. But you need to be proportionate and think about what's applicable for your organisation. And kind of have, I think essentially kind of having good points of contact, so a good designated, kind of a safeguarding lead, a trustee that is able to support and kind of understands safeguarding more broadly, is a really good starting point. Because if there was an incident that was very unusual that kind of happened, you would have some good people within the organisation to think about what those next steps are, and not to be afraid to go outside of the organisation to NCVO, NSPCC, other resources, talking to the local authority if you're unsure. Always err on the side of checking and reporting and confirming, rather than not. But yes, in terms of kind of best practice, the expectation would be that you would, all the different groups of people that you come into contact with are covered within the policies, for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Alex. And just sort of sticking on vulnerable adults, is there any help or advice that is out there, or clear definitions as to what actually is an adult at risk? Because there's the potential, particularly those organisations working with volunteers, for example. Is it easy to be able to sort of determine whether one volunteer is or isn't potentially classed as an adult at risk?
So I'll go back in the slides, because I didn't linger on this, because it's just kind of helpful to point it out, but that there is a formal definition of adults at risk. So as I said, those that can change kind of from for that adult, because at one point in time they might be an adult at risk, but at another point they may not be. However, the safeguarding duties, kind of legal safeguarding duties for adults at risk, apply when you're working with anybody who meets these different criteria. So has needs for care and support, whether or not the local authority is meeting any of those needs, plus is experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect, and is also, as a result of these care and support needs, is unable to protect themselves from either the risk of or the experience of abuse or neglect. Now, for kind of charities kind of working with kind of individuals, that's going to be very complex for you to kind of assess. But I think you need to think about the groups that you are working with, and if there's the potential for any of those individuals to be an adult at risk, then you need to have, I think, kind of conversations with them to understand what their needs might be, but also you can seek, again, kind of further advice on that, kind of from the Ancraft Trust or your local authority if you're unsure. In terms of kind of how you would manage and support those adults at risk, I guess it kind of goes back to my kind of earlier point about the culture and the holistic nature. So there can be this is a narrow legal definition, statutory definition. Actually, we would be really encouraging you to, and the Charity Commission encourages charities to think holistically. So actually, if you have robust policies in place for all adults who engage with your services, then adults at risk will be covered within that, but should also have specific reference within policies and procedures as well. But a robust approach for all adults will support adults at risk specifically as well.
Well, thank you, Alex. Keeping you under the spotlight of questioning. So there's clearly some community action groups or community involvement groups that are on the call. Do the same responsibilities apply to a community group, CIC, as a charity? And if they are different, can you articulate what some of those subtle differences may or may not be?
So, I mean, in terms of kind of the statutory kind of requirements, so if we go back to the slides that I shared around kind of the working together guidance and the Care Act guidance, for example, it's clear in kind of all of that guidance that it's everybody's responsibility. So within that kind of different framework that you might be sitting within, you're still working with people and delivering services, or providing something to people and working with. So you do have that responsibility. The responsibility for safeguarding lies with everybody, and kind of there's significant risk still for your group if you were not to kind of respond if you were aware of an incident, if something was brought to you. So there needs to be steps in place, but again, it sort of goes back to what's proportional for your group, and what's kind of relevant for you. So given I don't know the specifics of kind of the kind of groups that we're kind of talking about, I'd really encourage you to have a look at some of the different kind of support and kind of further guidance that I've kind of that's within the webinar, to think about what is applicable and what isn't. But fundamentally, yes, the safeguarding responsibility lies with everybody. Companies have the same responsibilities to keep people safe. It just might, it's still included within the same guidance, and the legislation is still there. There might just be different processes that kick into place. There might be different regulatory frameworks around a company, for example, compared to a charity, kind of focusing on the Charity Commission here. But yeah, I would kind of look a bit further and think about that.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I think we'll probably squeeze in one more, maybe two. There's been a few questions with regards to so a number of charities that provide services potentially to under 18s and over 18s, and sort of blurring that line between the potential of them being classed as a child versus being classed as an adult, and potentially I can't speak, can't put my teeth in, accessing services or the same services from the same organisation that, over that period between switching from being younger than 18 to over 18. Is it appropriate to have a policy that covers both children and adults, or do you need separate policies with regards to safeguarding around children, and then how you regard to them or work with them as an adult? Is that, can you join it or can you separate it?
It can absolutely be joined up, definitely. I think, again, apologies, I probably keep saying kind of similar responses because it's challenging to kind of, without knowing your specific charity circumstances, give specific, but it's again about being proportional. So I'm very aware that safeguarding can feel like a massive, quite scary kind of thing, and there are really important aspects to consider, and hopefully I've kind of covered off lots of the key bits for you, but also be proportionate. So you don't need huge unwielding kind of policies that are difficult to read, that are inaccessible. That's not what we want. We want something that encompasses what you do, that is easy to read, easy to understand, and covers off the key risks that you've identified through your kind of risk assessments. So absolutely fine for children and adults policies to be together under one safeguarding policy. But again, if there was specific risk, if you as a charity had identified that there was specific risks around what that young person was doing when they were kind of under 18, and then the differences of what they were doing kind of when they were 18. I mean, there's definitely risks around that we would need to think about. If, for example, it was a child who was accessing services till the age of 18 and then they became a volunteer, for example, as an adult, there needs to be kind of consideration of how risky that is based on what you're delivering and the relationships that might be in existence within the organisation, boundaries and kind of separation of those roles, for example. So that might be something you need to consider. If it was kind of a child / young person who was accessing services and then continued to access them as an adult, that could be within your kind of general safeguarding policies. But I would I don't know if that's what any of the if any of you have these questions, but if you were thinking about situations which can often happen in youth work organisations where or other organisations where the service users of services who then stop using services and then become a volunteer, for example. So I would say in that kind of that kind of situation, you need to think about the kind of what's appropriate and what's appropriate within those roles, whether there needs to be some time out of that service, how they kind of relate to their peers, or how they manage that, and how you support them to manage those relationships to make sure that everybody's kept safe and that boundaries are not blurred. But that might be something that potentially you need to that does happen in various different charities.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and thank you for allowing me and everybody to put you on the spot with some of those questions. There are more. I think probably what we'll do is digest them and consider them for a future topic, a future webinar or something like that, where we perhaps dive into some of these details. So thank you everyone for putting your questions in. Apologies if we've not got round to one that you may have asked specifically. Nick, can I hand back to you just to sort of point us in some other directions, but also wrap us up, please?
Absolutely, yeah. And thank you for such a comprehensive overview, Alex. You can have covered an enormous amount of kind of content in a short space of time. And thanks, Matt, too, for kind of expertly facilitating that kind of Q&A. I think we had like 30 or 40 kind of questions. I imagine to cover loads of the topics that were kind of coming through, so thank you. But before we can cover the final few slides, a 2-question snap poll is about to appear on your screen any moment to get your initial thoughts on how you found today's webinar. If you'd like to provide additional feedback, a short survey will appear in your browser when you leave the meeting. And for us, it would be great to hear about the things that you enjoyed, where we can make improvements, and what further guidance and support would be helpful from NCVO and from Zurich as well. But today's one hour webinar has hopefully served as a helpful introduction and a refresher to safeguarding. But if you're keen for more formal learning opportunities, NCVO has a number of training courses that will help you. So we have a 1-day course covering safeguarding essentials in charities, which will help you know how to effectively manage concerns and allegations, be able to implement safer working practices for your organisation, which embed safeguarding practices. And importantly, you'll have the space to share experiences and learning with your peers, getting advice from the trainer to those questions that are specific to your organisation, which we haven't had the chance to kind of cover today. There's another 1-day course specifically for designated safeguarding leads in charities, which covers the role of effective policies and procedures in building a positive safeguarding culture, how to receive and manage safeguarding concerns, including confidentiality and data protection best practice, and effective signposting and referral processes, including responding to inaction. And finally, we've got a 1/2-day course covering safeguarding essentials specifically for trustees. And I think there are kind of key questions about the role of kind of trustees in the board in kind of safeguarding practices. So there's 3 kind of training courses that NCVO offer. And a 1/2-day training course starts at £38 for members, which includes the all-important 30% member discount. And on membership, if you're not yet a member of NCVO, we would love to have you join our community of over 70,000 organisations, from the biggest helping charities to the smallest community groups. Our members are at the heart of everything that we do, and we exist to make your lives that little bit easier so that you can focus on things that really matter and make the greatest impact to the communities that you serve. So more information about becoming a member can be found on the NCVO website, or do can reach out to our membership colleagues by emailing membership@ncvo.org.uk. So before we sign off, on behalf of my colleagues at NCVO, I'd like to give a special thanks to Alex and to Matt for their time and their expertise today. And a huge thank you to all of you for joining us. I think at the height of the webinar, we had 360 people online, which is great. I hope it's been a helpful introduction and a refresher to safeguarding, and the tools, resources and training we have linked to will hopefully help you to build upon your safeguarding good practice and knowledge. Again, please spare a minute or two to share your feedback with us, which you'll be able to do when the webinar ends. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.